August 1994. Moscow. A scorching summer so hot it could melt the asphalt. In front of an unremarkable three-story building on Varshavskoe Highway, the kind of drab place that probably housed some dull Soviet research institute, a crowd of several thousand has gathered. The air vibrates with tension, shouting, and desperation. People are trying to block one of the city's busiest roads. Riot police have been called in, heavy armor, helmets, shields, barely holding the line. It looks like violence could erupt at any moment. It sounds like the opening scene of a Hollywood thriller about a popular uprising, doesn't it? But as always, the devil is in the details. These people on the brink of clashing with the police are not revolutionaries. They are defrauded investors. Just days ago, their world collapsed. The company they entrusted with their savings, the now legendary MMM, burst like a soap bubble. Their shares, their tickets, their hopes for a brighter life turned into worthless scraps of paper overnight. And now they're here at the company's headquarters, demanding justice, punishment for the con man who stole their money? Not even close. They're chanting, "Hands off Mavrodi," and "Freedom for Sergei Mavrodi." They hold up his portraits like icons. They're ready to protect their robber from the state, which, in their eyes, is the real enemy. This was Stockholm Syndrome on a national scale. How did a man who built the largest financial pyramid in Russian history in just 6 months, leaving, by some estimates, up to 15 million people with nothing, become a folk hero, almost a messiah? To understand this theater of the absurd, this tragicomedy of the Russian 90s, we have to rewind the tape to the very beginning. To the story of a man who, as a child, was essentially given a death sentence by doctors. Sergei Panteleyevich Mavrodi was born in Moscow in 1955 in a typical Soviet family. His father was a technician, his mother an economist. No privileges, no golden opportunities. Quite the opposite. The family seemed cursed by illness. His father died of lung cancer when Sergei was 25, his mother of liver cancer 6 years later. Sergei himself wasn't spared either. Doctors diagnosed him with a severe congenital heart defect and delivered a verdict that sounded like a sentence. The boy was unlikely to live past 18. Perhaps it was this awareness that life is a sprint, not a marathon, that shaped his character. He lived as if every day could be his last, as if rules didn't apply and tomorrow wasn't guaranteed. Despite his condition, he was a surprisingly active child. He racked up 12 concussions, and even then, the central paradox of his nature revealed itself. On one hand, he had a phenomenal, almost photographic memory. By his own account, he needed to hear a poem once to memorize it. He easily won school Olympiads in math and physics, showing a sharp and unusual intellect. On the other hand, his grades were mediocre. By senior year, he had lost all interest in the sciences. He enrolled at the prestigious Moscow Institute of Electronic Engineering to study applied mathematics, and immediately became a champion of skipping classes. His last name ended up on the Hall of Shame, marked with 300 missed hours. He was bored. Bored in the suffocating aquarium of Soviet life, where everything was pre-assigned: university, job placement, a closed research institute, a salary of 120 rubles, and endless waiting for something that would never come. So he found an escape. While still a student, he dove into a world the Soviet system dismissed with a sneer as speculation, and the rest of the world simply called business. He started small, recording and selling pirated Western music tapes and VHS movies. This became his true university, where he learned supply and demand, marketing, and risk the practical way. That's when he first met the system face to face. He was arrested by the OBKHSS, the Soviet Department for Combating Economic Crimes. 10 days in detention and a stern warning. He got off lightly, but he learned the core lesson: the system is your enemy, and to survive you must be smarter, faster, and bolder. And then the system cracked. Perestroika began. The air of freedom that smelled like hope to millions smelled like something very specific to Mavrodi: big money. In 1989, he registered a cooperative called MMM. The name was simply an acronym formed from the founders' last names: Sergei himself, his younger brother Vyacheslav, and Vyacheslav's wife, Olga Melnikova. The latter two were nominal partners, extras in a one-man show. From the very beginning, Sergei ran everything, and his instincts didn't fail him. He found a genuine gold mine, importing office equipment, In a country where personal computers were exotic curiosities, and where people joked that Soviet microchips were the biggest microchips in the world, the demand for Western hardware was enormous. Business took off so fast that MMM soon dwarfed tens of thousands of similar cooperatives. Mavrodi understood the power of advertising early on, but he didn't want to be just another name. He wanted a sensation, and he delivered one. On July 31st, 1991, MMM organized an event Moscow would never forget. For one day, the company paid for everyone's ride on the Moscow metro, a spectacle of unprecedented generosity. By various estimates, it cost him around 600,000 rubles, a colossal sum at the time. But the effect exceeded anything he could have hoped for. The next morning, the whole country knew about MMM and its mysterious leader. It was the first step, a trial balloon proving just how easy it was to capture the trust and admiration of the masses. Only a little more than 2 years remained before he would build the Great Pyramid. The free metro stunt was only a prelude, a flashy overture before the main opera. The real performance began in 1992, when the MMM cooperative was restructured into a joint stock company. And on February 1st, 1994, the star of this entire drama walked onto the stage, the shares of AOOT MMM. They hit the open market at a nominal price of 1,000 rubles, a sum almost anyone could afford. But Mavrodi wasn't selling simple securities. In a country where the very word stock sounded to most people like a spell from some distant, unfamiliar world, he was selling something far more valuable. He was selling a dream that life could be lived, not merely survived. And to sell that dream, he came up with a slogan so simple and hypnotically elegant that it became a mantra for millions. Today is always more expensive than yesterday. The company introduced so-called two-way quotes, promising to buy back its own shares at any moment, but always at a higher price. The rate changed twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and it always, absolutely always, went up. It was a perpetual motion machine of wealth, a financial paradise made real, exactly what a country exhausted by hyperinflation and empty store shelves was desperate to believe in. The first issue of shares, nearly 1 million of them, sold out instantly. People brought cash, borrowed from neighbors, emptied their savings accounts, anything to get in. When Mavrodi tried to register a second issue, this time for 1 billion shares, the system he despised finally bared its teeth. The Ministry of Finance sensed something was off and refused permission. For anyone else, that would have been the end. But not for Mavrodi. When he hit an obstacle, he didn't fight it, he sidestepped it. With the finesse of a stage magician, he unveiled the now infamous MMM tickets. Legally, they were not securities and therefore not subject to ministry oversight. In reality, they were the exact same thing as shares. These tickets were the peak of his cynicism and his brilliance. They looked almost identical to a Soviet 10-ruble note, the most trusted, respectable piece of past currency. But with one crucial twist. In the center, where the portrait of the proletarian leader had sat for decades, now appeared the face of Sergei Mavrodi himself. Modesty had never been one of his virtues. He hadn't just built a company, he had minted his own currency. Mavrodics, as people affectionately called them. And to fully shield himself, he added one more legal trick. The tickets weren't sold, oh no. People were said to voluntarily donate money directly to Mavrodi, and in return they received these pretty papers as souvenirs. When they wanted their money back, Mavrodi would voluntarily donate the required amount back to them. No buying, no selling, no liability, the perfect crime. But even the most ingenious mechanism is useless without fuel, and the fuel for this machine was people, their faith, their hope, their money. To ignite that faith into a nationwide blaze, Mavrodi launched the largest, most creative, and most devastating advertising campaign in Russian history. These weren't commercials. This was the country's first national soap opera, a serialized tale of sudden happiness that millions watched with bated breath. Its main character was an ordinary excavator operator named Leonya Golubkov, not a banker, not an intellectual, just a regular guy, one of millions. In the very first ad, after receiving income from his MMM investment, he buys his wife Rita a pair of boots. Just boots. But that was only the beginning. In later episodes, he buys Rita a fur coat, then furniture, then a car. The crowning moment was Rita's now legendary line, "I want a house in Paris." Leonia was irresistibly charming in his simplicity. He looked straight into the camera and said the phrase that struck a chord all across the country, "I'm not freeloading, I'm a partner." There was magic in those words. Mavrodi didn't just give people hope for riches, he gave them dignity, the feeling of belonging to something big and successful. Leonia wasn't alone. There were others. A lonely schoolteacher, Marina Sergeyevna, newlyweds Igor and Yulia, pensioners Nikolai Fomich and Elizaveta Andreevna. People saw themselves on the screen, their problems, their dreams, and they believed. Believed so deeply that when Mexican telenovela star Victoria Rufo, the iconic Just Maria, appeared in one of the ads, no one even blinked. In the world of MMM, everything seemed possible. The scale of this nationwide obsession is still difficult to grasp. Even the most conservative estimates say that between 10 and 15 million people invested in the pyramid, the population of an entire European country. Mavrodi later boasted that at one point he controlled a third of Russia's entire federal budget. And that doesn't sound all that far-fetched. Witnesses recalled that the central office on Varshavskoe Highway looked like something out of a fever dream. There was so much cash, they physically couldn't count it. They stopped counting banknotes and started weighing them. Eventually, they simply measured the money in rooms. One former employee even said they had a dedicated job title, the person who watches the room with the money. At its peak, the structure was making, by some estimates, up to $50 million a day. In cash, hauled away in trucks, people sold apartments, cars, summer houses, anything, and brought the money to MMM. Mavrodiks became a full-fledged parallel currency. You could use them at markets, in shops. Their exchange rate was listed in newspapers next to the dollar. According to rumors, even the cafeteria of the Ministry of Finance, the very agency meant to stop all of this, was selling MMM shares. It seemed like this fairy tale could last forever. But every pyramid, no matter how grand, has one defining trait. It will collapse. And the higher it rises, the louder the crash when it falls. Any great party eventually attracts the attention of the neighbors. And when that party becomes so loud it shakes the entire building, the neighbors inevitably call the police. In the case of MMM, the neighbor was the Russian state. At first, the authorities viewed Mavrodi's activities with a strange mix of confusion and cautious approval. His pyramid acted like a gigantic vacuum cleaner, sucking excess cash out of the public's hands, which, paradoxically, helped slow hyperinflation. Millions of citizens, instead of taking to the streets and denouncing the reforms, were busy playing the exhilarating game of buy and sell, learning capitalism in its wildest, most ruthless form. But it didn't take long for the Kremlin and the White House to realize that the monster they had silently allowed to grow had developed a will of its own and had become a genuine threat. Mavrodi, once just a fabulously rich businessman, was turning into a figure with enormous influence over millions of minds. In the eyes of the public, he was a far greater authority than the government. The government took away and devalued, Mavrodi gave. He was a new Rasputin, a shadow ruler whose word could stir or calm a crowd. Rumor had it that President Boris Yeltsin grumbled irritably that Leonia Golubkov is getting on my nerves. Patience snapped. The machinery of the state turned, slowly but inevitably, against its prodigal son. The first strike came from the heavy artillery of the media. Television channels that just yesterday aired cheerful stories about Leonia buying Rita new boots now began showing exposés revealing MMM as a simple fraud. Prime Minister Viktor Chernomyrdin, in his unmistakable style, warned, the opportunities to make easy money will soon disappear. Next came the tax authorities, who suddenly discovered gross violations in one of MMM's subsidiaries and issued a fine of 49.9 billion rubles, an astronomical sum at the time. It was a direct hit to the heart of the financial empire. But Mavrodi wasn't Mavrodi if he scared easily. In response, he made a move so bold it stunned everyone. He went all in. He published an open letter to the authorities as a paid advertisement in newspapers, ending with a thinly veiled threat. So the authorities don't like Leonia Golubkov and Marina Sergeyevna. But does Leonia Golubkov like the authorities? Does Marina Sergeyevna like the authorities? No one has asked them, yet. It was an ultimatum. He threatened that if they didn't leave him alone, he would launch a nationwide referendum of no confidence in the government, promising to gather the required million signatures in just 1 week. At that moment, he likely felt omnipotent, certain that the people, his people, would follow him. But he miscalculated. The magic sustained by faith in tomorrow will be more expensive began to fade. State counter-propaganda, combined with rumors about the company's troubles, did its job. People panicked, and instead of bringing money to MMM's cash desks, they rushed to withdraw it. The inflow of new investors, the lifeblood of the pyramid, dried up, and without it, there was nothing to pay the old investors. The financial engine that once seemed eternal choked and died. Then came the day millions of Russians will remember for the rest of their lives, July 29, 1994. The fairy tale was over. By personal decree, Sergei Mavrodi announced a 127-fold reduction in the price of MMM shares and tickets, returning them to their original nominal value of 1,000 rubles. He, of course, promised that now they would grow even faster, but no one believed him anymore. Heavenly profits turned to ashes overnight. The bubble burst with a deafening crack, burying under its ruins the savings and hopes of millions. And on August 4, 1994, the final act of this drama began. Remember the scene we opened with? Riot police storming the central MMM office on Varshavskoe Highway. But the most dramatic events that day unfolded elsewhere. The entire country, glued to their TV screens, watched live as special forces broke down the door to Mavrodi's own apartment. Commandos smashing their way in, a bewildered financial genius in a simple tracksuit being led out by the arms. Inside the apartment, where people imagined piles of gold, they found nothing of value, just a collection of rare butterflies and cash equivalent to roughly $700,000. A drop in the ocean of the empire he had built. Mavrodi's arrest triggered a nationwide hysteria. But as we already know, the fury of the deceived wasn't directed at him. It was directed at the authorities. People genuinely believed the state had destroyed a perfectly functioning machine that was making them rich, and that if not for the government's interference, the free money would have flowed forever. They demanded his release so he could bring everything back, but there was nothing left to bring back. The money from new investors had been spent paying the old ones, and the rest, according to persistent rumors, had been hauled away to unknown destinations in those legendary cash-filled trucks. Behind the dry statistics lay real human tragedy. Officially, at least 50 people who lost everything took their own lives. Tens of thousands were left without homes, without savings, buried under enormous debts. People who yesterday felt like partners and dreamed of a house in Paris woke up in a harsh reality where they had nothing but worthless pieces of paper with the face of the man who had promised them a miracle and instead stole their future. The era of the Great Deception reached its logical end. But the story of the greatest con artist Russia had ever known was only just beginning. It looked as if the game was over. The great schemer was behind bars, his empire lay in ruins, and defrauded investors were mourning their vanished savings. Any other story would have ended there. But the story of Sergei Mavrodi wasn't just a criminal chronicle, it was a handbook on surviving in a world gone mad. Sitting in a pre-trial detention cell, he didn't write remorseful letters or sink into despair. He did something no one expected. He went into politics. Right from jail, he announced his candidacy in a parliamentary by-election for the State Duma. It was a move worthy of a genius of cynicism. He knew perfectly well that a deputy's mandate wasn't a way to serve the people. It was a magic talisman, granting the most precious thing in Russia of the 1990s. Immunity from prosecution. And once again, he pressed the very same button that had already brought him success, the boundless, irrational faith ordinary people had in him. His campaign was almost comically simple. He promised just one thing: elect me, I'll be released, and I'll pay everyone back. And the unimaginable happened. The very country he had just stripped to the bone elected him. On October 30th, 1994, Sergei Mavrodi, still under arrest, still charged with fraud, became a member of the Russian parliament. The prison doors opened, and he walked out. His political career was probably the shortest and most absurd in Russian history. He wrote no laws, attended no sessions, and refused his parliamentary salary and privileges. There was only one thing he wanted: immunity. MMM's offices, sealed by the police, were instantly transformed into State Duma deputy reception centers, and thus became untouchable. It was a slap in the face of the entire state system. But the system recovered from its shock and struck back. A year later, on October 6, 1995, his fellow lawmakers, fed up with the mockery, voted almost unanimously to strip him of his mandate under a unique pretext: absenteeism. His shield of immunity vanished and the threat of prison became real again. Mavrodi tried the trick once more, registering as a candidate in the 1996 presidential election, but this time the Central Election Commission rejected his signatures, and then he simply disappeared, vanished. He was placed on a federal, then international wanted list. Rumors swirled for years. Some said he was hiding in Greece, others said Scandinavia, enjoying his stolen millions. The truth, as often happens, was both more mundane and more astonishing. For nearly 8 years, the most wanted fraudster in Russia never left Moscow. He lived in a rented apartment under a false name. But don't imagine him quietly writing memoirs. Mavrodi couldn't live without the game, without the thrill, without the risk. While underground, cut off from the world, he made another leap into the future. He launched a new, even more ambitious scheme, this time in the emerging virtual space. He created Stock Generation, a financial pyramid disguised as a stock market simulation game, aimed not at Russian pensioners, but at savvy users in the US, Canada, and Western Europe. It was 1998. The internet was just entering every household, and Mavrodi was among the first to grasp its limitless potential for fraud. Hundreds of thousands of foreigners fell victim to his new scheme before the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission caught on and froze the company's accounts. The phoenix hadn't just risen from the ashes, it had spread its wings and flown across the ocean. But everything ends. On January 31, 2003, he was finally arrested in that same Moscow apartment. During the search, police found a forged passport. The circle closed. Then came a trial that dragged on for years. Another farce. Out of 15 million victims, only a little over 10,000 were officially recognized. The original tax evasion charge had already expired by statute of limitations, and so, on April 28, 2007, the verdict was announced. 4.5 years in prison for large-scale fraud. Just think about that number. 4.5 years for the ruined lives of millions. For comparison, Mavrodi's American counterpart, Bernard Madoff, received 150 years for his pyramid scheme. Even this laughably mild sentence had nearly all been served during the investigation. A month after the verdict, in May 2007, he walked free. What does a man do after serving time for the greatest financial scam in his country's history? Retire? Become a law-abiding citizen? Not Sergei Mavrodi. Barely outside the prison gates, he began preparing for the next round. He already understood that his name was a brand, and that human greed and belief in miracles were inexhaustible resources. In 2011, he announced the creation of MMM 2011, this time decoding the acronym as "We Can Do a Lot." He didn't even pretend it wasn't another pyramid, and people brought him money again. This time his gaze shifted to the former Soviet republics and then far beyond: India, China, Nigeria, South Africa. The great schemer was back in the game, and now his ambitions were truly global. The stories of great swindlers rarely end quietly. Usually their final chapter is written by a bullet, a courtroom, or a comfortable retirement on a tropical island. But the fate of Sergei Mavrodi, like his entire life, chose a completely different path. On March 26, 2018, he collapsed from heart trouble at an ordinary bus stop in Moscow. A passerby called an ambulance. At the hospital, he died. A man who once claimed to control a third of Russia's national budget, a man whose name every citizen of the country knew, died alone, waiting for a bus. His funeral, paid for by former MMM investors, was attended by so few people that even his own brother, Vyacheslav, did not come. It was Vyacheslav who forbade burying Sergei next to their parents. A disgraceful, and in its own way fitting end. The great schemer who built his empire on human connections and trust died utterly alone. But with Mavrodi's death, the most important question did not die. How? How was such a colossal fraud even possible? To understand that, you have to remember what Russia was in the early 1990s. It was a world after an apocalypse. A vast country, the Soviet Union, had collapsed. For 70 years, people lived in a system where the state decided everything for them: where to work, how much they earned, what food cost. Words like stocks, dividends, the stock market sounded to most like jargon from a distant and hostile Martian civilization. And then these people, financially illiterate, as naive as children, were thrown into the wild jungle of capitalism. Hyperinflation was raging. Money saved over decades turned to dust in weeks. The very state that was supposed to protect them had already robbed its own citizens multiple times through currency reforms, creating deep, generational distrust toward any authority. And in this wasteland, in this vacuum of faith and hope, Mavrodi appeared. He didn't just offer a way to preserve money, he offered a miracle, a simple, almost childish mechanism that worked, at least at first. To millions, he wasn't a con man. He was the man who outplayed the hated state and won. He was one of them. And that is the central paradox of his legacy. Ask someone today who Yegor Gaidar or Anatoly Chubais were, the men who, whatever one thinks of them, tried to save a collapsing national economy. At best, people will call them the cause of all the country's troubles. But ask who Mavrodi was, and many, even victims, will smile and say, oh, the great con artist, the Ostap Bender of our time. He never became a figure of absolute evil in public memory. Why? Because he was a genius of self-mythology. He didn't just create advertising, he created a legend. His character Leonya Golubkov, dreaming of buying his wife a pair of boots, became a folk hero, part of popular culture. This story of an ordinary man who became a partner was stronger than the bitter truth of lost homes and ruined lives. Mavrodi gave people an illusion, and for that illusion, many were willing to forgive the reality. He wasn't a dull bureaucrat in a gray suit. He was a bold trickster who challenged the system. And in Russia, there has always been a secret love for such rebels, even when they're criminals. His later ventures, MMM 2011, his expansion into Africa and Asia, and even his own cryptocurrency Mavro, were merely echoes of his former grandeur, faint aftershocks of the explosion that shook the country in the 1990s. He kept trying, right up until the end, to recreate that magic spark. But the world had changed. People had grown more cautious, more financially literate, and he himself had faded into a figure from another era. So what does his astonishing story ultimately teach us? Perhaps the most important lesson: pyramids are not built of bricks and lies. They are built out of human greed, human fear, and, above all, the desperate belief in a miracle, the belief that you can get everything without giving anything. The tools change. Today, it's not paper tickets with a portrait, but nameless cryptocurrencies, shiny NFTs, and anonymous online investment platforms. But the essence remains the same. Today is always more expensive than yesterday. That slogan is immortal.